Welcome, weary traveler. As you settle in, take a moment to allow the world around you to soften. Let your thoughts quieten, and your body begin its slow surrender to rest. Tonight, I invite you on a journey, not into the grand castles or gilded courts of medieval Europe, but into the quieter, soot-covered corners of village life, into the forge, into the life of a blacksmith. The medieval blacksmith rarely finds a place in tales of kings and battles. Yet, without his hands, swords would remain unsharpened, horses unshod, and village life unworkable. His was not a life of glory, but of greater life shaped by fire, iron, and sweat. As you listen, imagine the rhythm of the hammer, a steady beat not unlike a heartbeat, echoing through timber walls and drifting across cobbled lanes. This was the cadence of survival, the pulse of a life spent in service to a world that needed his fire, but often forgot his name. So now, close your eyes if you like, and let us begin with a gentle immersion into the daily life of the medieval blacksmith. The sun rises slowly over the thatched rooftops of a small 13th century English village. Mist clings to the earth like a worn shawl. From a squat building at the village edge, a dull orange glow pushes back the morning haze. Inside, the forge is already awake. The blacksmith is a silhouette in flickering light, broad-shouldered, soot-smudged, and weary before the day has even begun. His eyes are rimmed in soot, not sleep. His arms, thick from years of swinging hammers, move with practiced precision. This is not a place of chaos. It is a place of rhythm. The forge crackles and groans. Bellows hiss like a slumbering beast, coaxing the fire into renewed fury. The air is heavy thick with the tang of iron filings and the bitter scent of charcoal smoke. The walls, blackened with years of labor, absorb the sound of metal meeting metal, a dull clang, then another, then another. It is a languager, repetitive, but full of meaning. His day begins before others stir and stretches long into dusk. The blacksmith's tasks are many. Horseshoes must be made and fitted, plowshares mended, nails shaped, hinges crafted, swords repaired. Each task demands not only strength but knowledge, temperatures, techniques, alloys, timing. Too hot and the iron crumbles, too cold and it resists the hammer's will. Unlike the romantic notion of a solitary smith laboring with fire and magic, most medieval blacksmiths operated in small, crowded workshops. Apprentices, often young boys, scurried to pump the bellows, fetch tools, and observe the master's technique. Journeymen, who had completed their training but not yet earned the title of master, handled more complex tasks under careful supervision. Food was taken when time allowed coarse bread, perhaps some cheese, and a mug of watered ale to soothe the dust in his throat. Meals were often eaten with one hand, the other holding tongs still warm from the forge. Outside, villagers queued with requests. The smith, though not a noble, held a crucial position. His forge was as necessary as the church or the mill. He was both craftsman and fixer, and in many places his word held weight. Yet, his work took its toll. Burns were common, as were repetitive injuries. Few blacksmiths lived into old age with straight backs or steady hands. The forge, always hot and restless, left little room for comfort. In winter, its heat was a blessing. In summer, it was a slow suffocation. But the blacksmith endured, for there was always something broken, always something bent that needed straightening. The tools of his trade were extensions of his will. The anvil, a battered iron slab passed down through generations. The hammer, often wrapped in leather to ease the bite of its handle. The tongs, varied in shape and size, each suited to its task. His workspace was cluttered but sacred, a chaotic order known only to him. At the end of the day, long after the light had faded from the sky and the village had settled into quiet rest, the blacksmith doused his coals. The hiss of steam against embers marked the close of labor. He would remove his leather apron, stained and cracked, and wipe the soot from his face with a cloth darker than the night outside. And yet, sleep came slowly. The ring of the anvil still echoed in his ears. His hands, though idle, twitched with remembered strikes. The work did not end with daylight. It followed him, like smoke clinging to skin. In his dreams, the forge still burned. Imagine yourself as a boy of 12, perhaps 13. Your hands are still calloused from helping in the fields, your shoulders narrow beneath a worn linen tunic. One morning, Your father walks you to the edge of the village, where the forge breathes smoke into the morning air like a dragon at rest. You are not told to be brave or to learn quickly. Only this: watch, listen, work. Thus begins the life of an apprentice blacksmith in the Middle Ages. The path to becoming a blacksmith was as long and arduous as the work itself. It began with apprenticeship, typically a 7-year journey of obedience, observation, and increasingly difficult labor. The apprentice was not paid. In fact, his family might offer payment or favors in return for the opportunity. In exchange, he received food, shelter, and instruction. The forge became both school and prison. During these early years, the apprentice rarely touched iron. He fetched water, swept the floor, stoked the fire, and turned the great leather bellows for hours on end. His days were punctuated by the clang of tools, the scolding of the master, and the heat that clung to him like a second skin. Evenings were spent cleaning tools, or practicing simple tasks like sharpening nails or shaping horseshoe blanks. By the flickering light of tallow candles, he studied the nature of flame and steel. Years passed. Gradually, he was permitted to strike under supervision, assisting the master in large jobs by synchronizing his hammer to the master's lead. This was called striking a duet of rhythm and strength. It required discipline, timing, and trust. A single mistimed blow could ruin a day's work or break a finger. Eventually, if his skills proved adequate, the apprentice graduated to a journeyman. He could now earn a wage and travel from village to village, offering his labor in exchange for board and coin. Many wandered for years, building their reputation and skill. The term journeyman itself comes from the French journey a day, because he was paid by the day for his work. To become a master, however, was no small feat. In cities and large towns, guilds regulated this process. These powerful associations ensured that only qualified individuals could open a forge and train others. To be accepted, a journeyman had to produce a masterpiece item judged by senior members of the guild. This could be a lock with intricate mechanisms, a perfectly symmetrical set of tools, or a delicate grill. It was not enough to be strong. One had to be precise, thoughtful, and creative. If successful, the journeyman could establish his own shop, but that too required resources, forge, tools, and often the political favor of the guild or local lord. In rural areas, where guilds held less sway, a talented blacksmith might find work more easily but with fewer protections. Those who did achieve mastery held a respected place in society. They could marry, own land, and take on apprentices of their own. Some even served as village elders or advisors. Their wealth, however, was usually modest, built from necessity, not luxury. Their riches were measured not in gold, but in the steady flow of work. But not all blacksmiths followed this traditional path. Some were pressed into service during times of war, forging weapons and armor for local lords. Others specialized early, becoming farriers who cared for horses, or locksmiths working on the delicate mechanisms prized by noble estates. In larger cities, blacksmiths might serve royalty, or work exclusively for a cathedral, fashioning iron gates or ornate chandeliers. These roles brought prestige, but also isolation. The work was demanding, and the pressure great. There are records fragments in old guild ledgers, marginalia in parish books of blacksmiths who rose to unexpected prominence. One such figure was Baldwin the Hammerer, a smith of Flanders in the 12th century, whose skill in forging chainmail earned him the patronage of a local duke. He never became a noble himself, but his sons were educated and went on to serve as scribes and clerics, unthinkable outcomes for the son of a peasant. Yet, for every Baldwin, there were hundreds more who remained nameless men who lived and died by the forge. Their stories survive only in the tools they left behind, rusted and buried beneath layers of time. A hinge here, a nail there. The artifacts of lives spent in quiet labor. So the path of the blacksmith was never a simple one. It was shaped by fire and sweat, by duty and craftsmanship. And though his hands were rough and his days hard, the blacksmith held something rare in the medieval world: control over his skill, and the quiet pride of shaping the world around him. Time has a way of covering the past in layers of soil and silence. The blacksmith's fire cooled centuries ago, his hammer long since stilled. And yet, beneath village greens, beneath collapsed cottages and the foundations of forgotten barns, the remnants of his life still wait quiet, patient, enduring. Archaeologists, with trowel and brush, have uncovered the quiet story of medieval blacksmithing. The evidence is rarely glamorous. There are no golden crowns or jeweled goblets in these digs. Instead, there are iron nails, bent and oxidized, horseshoes worn thin from use. Slag heaps those rough mounds of spent charcoal and metallic waste that mark the sites where forges once roared. These are not treasures, perhaps, but they speak more truthfully of daily life than any relic enshrined in glass. In the quiet countryside of Yorkshire, for instance, excavations at Warham Percy, deserted medieval village, revealed the outlines of a modest forge, a stone hearth, scorched and broken, a few twisted tools, blackened fragments of anvil supports embedded in the floor. Nearby, the skeletal remains of horses suggest the blacksmith may have doubled as a farrier, tending hooves as well as hinges. Each discovery is a whisper from the past. Take, for example, the discovery of smithing tools at an abbey site in France, tucked beneath monastic dormitories. It suggests that even the quiet world of monks required a forge to mend ploughs, reinforce doors, and make repairs. The smith, though not part of the cloistered order, was close enough to be indispensable. His labour, it seems, moved in parallel to prayer. Beyond tools and debris, culture too preserved traces of the blacksmith. In folklore and superstition, he loomed large equal parts, respected and feared. The forge, with its flame and its transformative power, was often seen as a place of mystery. Fire, after all, turned cold, lifeless ore into gleaming tools. To the untrained eye, this bordered on the magical. Some medieval folk believed blacksmiths could ward off evil. Iron, forged in fire, was said to repel spirits. A nail above the door, a horseshoe over the hearth. These were not decorations, but talismans born of the forge, meant to shield the home. And in some tales, the blacksmith outwits the devil himself. In one such legend, an old smith traps the devil in his workshop, forcing him to flee through a narrow chimney. In the rush, the soot-blackened devil loses part of his tale, explaining, as the story goes, why chimneys sometimes echo with hollow groans in winter. The blacksmith's role in religious life was more complicated. His work was essential but noisy, disruptive. In some towns, regulations forbade forging near churches on holy days. Yet the blacksmith's anvil was also symbolic. Some churches used broken anvils as fonts, sanctifying the work of labourers. Saints such as Eligius himself, a skilled metalworker, became patron saints of smiths, blending the divine with the practical. Interestingly, blacksmiths also appear in medieval manuscripts, etched in the margins as humorous caricatures, tiny figures pounding comically large hammers, or riding bellows as though they were steeds. These images weren't meant to mock, but to humanize. The blacksmith, always close but slightly apart from village life, was memorable enough to become inked in the edges of prayer books. The cultural memory of smithing also lingers in place names. Villages like Smithfield or Blacksmith's Hill mark the spots where the forge once stood. Sometimes a single street iron stained and curved from years of cart traffic remains as the only visible trace. And yet, what these remnants tell us is this: the blacksmith's world was never truly forgotten. Though the flame has cooled and the anvil rusted, the echoes remain in our language, in our myths, and in the soil beneath our feet. Archaeology does not resurrect the past in full, but it gives us glimpses of a hammer's imprint on the earth, a clinker of waste in the shadows of a hearth. These fragments, humble and half-buried, remind us that even the quietest lives leave a mark. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, one might assume that the blacksmith, a man of labour and soot, occupied a lowly place, far removed from the refined halls of the elite. And yet, his hammer struck closer to power than many might believe, for while the noble rode in gleaming armour, it was the blacksmith who forged the very steel that held kingdoms together. Among peasants and commoners, the village blacksmith was a figure of respect, but in the service of the elite, his value was magnified. Lords and barons, ever hungry for war, required swords, spears, helmets and mail. Castles demanded iron hinges strong enough to bear oak doors, portcullises that could fall with terrifying weight, and chains heavy enough to restrain prisoners or drawbridges. A skilled armourer, especially one capable of crafting plate armour, could command considerable patronage. Though he lived modestly and worked tirelessly, such a smith might be summoned to a noble's estate, and offered lodging, food, or even coin beyond the usual fare. His forge, temporarily relocated or built anew within castle walls, became a place of quiet industry amidst the bustle of knights and retainers. Yet even then, the blacksmith was rarely invited to dine among his employers. His presence was utilitarian, his hands too rough for the refined company of those he served. At best, he might receive a nod of acknowledgement, or a silver coin pressed discreetly into his hand. At worst, he might be blamed for a faulty rivet or a weakened chain. Contrast this with his own daily life, simple, predictable, and rooted in the rhythms of the land. The elite dined on roasted pheasant and sweet wine. The blacksmith took barley stew and black bread. Nobles adorned themselves in silks, while the smith wore thick wool or leather, stained dark from ash. While the lords debated land and lineage, the smith debated the merits of iron versus steel. And yet, they needed him. When war loomed, the village blacksmith was among the first summoned, not to fight but to arm. Sword production was grueling. Each blade required careful shaping, quenching, grinding. A single misstep, and the sword might snap in battle, failure with fatal consequences. Some smiths specialized in weapons, their forges echoing not just with function, but with form. Decorative pommels, etched hilts, balanced blades, these were not mere tools, but symbols of status and craftsmanship. In regions like Toledo in Spain or Solingen in the German lands, blacksmiths gained renown across borders for their superior blades. These centers of metallurgical excellence birthed smiths who operated under royal patronage. Their names, though often lost to time, were once known and respected across courts. But for every sword destined for a knight's scabbard, 100 nails were needed for a barn, a dozen hinges for a chest, or a new bit for a horse's bridle. The majority of blacksmiths never touched noble steel. Their world was agricultural, domestic, practical. They lived closer to manure than marble. Their labor, while indispensable, was largely invisible. The divide between blacksmith and elite was thus both physical and symbolic. The smith shaped the instruments of war and labor, but remained on the periphery of those who wielded them. He was vital, yet invisible, respected, yet apart. There were exceptions. In rare cases, a blacksmith might rise above his station. A particularly gifted craftsman, through long service or extraordinary skill, might be granted privileges, land, a title, or a place on a noble council. But such stories were anomalies, flickers of fortune in an otherwise static world. And so, while the blacksmith's anvil and the noble's sword seem worlds apart, they are bound by iron. One shaped the tools of power, the other wielded them. Their lives never truly touched, but they echoed each other, faintly, across the great divide of station and soot. As the hammer rose and fell within the smithy, its rhythm was more than mere labour. It was a song of economy, of interdependence, of local trade, and global currents. The medieval blacksmith, though rooted in a single place, was enmeshed in a wide and complex web of economic life, both village-bound and far-reaching. At its core, blacksmithing was a trade, and like all trades, it depended on both supply and demand. Iron had to be sourced, either locally from bog iron and shallow mines, or transported from regions rich in ore. Charcoal, essential for maintaining the high heat of the forge, was made from carefully harvested wood, often traded with colliers who burned logs in earthen mounds. Even tools wore down or broke, and new ones required material and, at times, assistance from travelling specialists. In small villages, trade was largely informal. A farmer might bring grain in exchange for new ploughshares. A tanner might offer leather for tool repairs. These barters kept the forge running when coins were scarce. The blacksmith, in turn, acted almost as a silent ledger-keeper balancing labour, materials, and favours owed. But in larger towns, the economic world was far more structured. Here, blacksmiths often operated under the oversight of guilds-powerful collectives that regulated training, prices, and quality. The Blacksmiths' Guild, or more specifically, the Guild of Smiths and Armourers, ensured that no one undercut prices or sold shoddy goods. They maintained standards, but also exclusivity. To work in a town, one had to be a guild member, and to join, one needed lineage, apprenticeship, and approval. Guilds offered security. In times of illness or injury, they might offer support. They mediated disputes, sponsored feast days, and organized processions in honor of patron saints. But they also enforced strict rules. A blacksmith caught selling outside the guild's market, or training an unlicensed apprentice, could be fined or banned from practice. Interestingly, there were often distinctions within the smithing profession itself. Farriers, for instance, who specialized in horse-related ironwork, sometimes formed their own guilds. So did locksmiths, cutlers, who made blades and knives, and whitesmiths, who worked with tin and lighter metals. In some cities, these groups competed for influence, carving out economic territories. The market itself was an anchor point in the smith's commercial life. Weekly fairs drew buyers from across the region. There, blacksmiths might sell everything from simple nails and rivets to ornate candlesticks, cauldrons, and even religious items like iron-bound crosses. A well-made axe or a sturdy gate hinge could travel far from its origin, changing hands many times and finding a home in distant villages. Trade was not always local. In the later medieval period, especially from the 13th century onward, towns near rivers and ports participated in broader networks of exchange. Iron from Sweden, steel from Damascus, and techniques from Moorish Spain circulated across Europe. A blacksmith in Bruges or Venice might have access to imported materials, allowing for finer craftsmanship and higher prices. But the economy also carried risks. The rising and falling of grain harvests affected how much peasants could pay. War could disrupt supply chains, or increase demand for weaponry, forcing blacksmiths into labor they neither desired nor felt equipped for. Plagues and famines, too, could silence a forge for months, robbing it of both customers and assistants. Despite these fluctuations, the blacksmith's position remained remarkably resilient. Iron was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Every household, every farm, every wagon, door and gate relied on it, and so the blacksmith became something more than just a tradesman. He was an economic constanta node of reliability in a world of shifting fortunes. And in his forge, where trade met tradition, you might glimpse the strange duality of medieval commerce, a world both highly localized and subtly global, where a village hinge and a noble sword might both begin with the same humble bar of iron. In the stillness of early morning, before the bellows groan and before iron meets hammer, the forge waits quiet, but filled with potential. Within that small and smoky space lies a kind of alchemy, not of the mystical sort, but one born of heat, timing, and deep, patient knowledge. The blacksmith was not merely a labourer, he was a scientist of the medieval world, a quiet master of transformation. Let us begin with the element at the heart of it, aileron. Iron ore was abundant, but not easily tamed. It had to be mined, crushed, roasted, and smelted before it could even reach the forge. Smelting involved heating the ore with charcoal in a Blumerian early furnace that produced a spongy mass of semi-pure iron known as a bloom. This bloom was then hammered over and over to remove impurities and shape it into a usable form. The smith rarely smelted the ore himself. Instead, he received ready iron dents, heavy bars known as billets ready for shaping. But not all iron was equal. There was wrought iron soft, malleable, ideal for tools, nails, and fittings. And then there was steel created by infusing iron with carbon, usually by repeated heating and folding. Steel was harder and more flexible, perfect for weapons and blades, but far more difficult to work with. Understanding the difference was not academic, it was essential. Too little carbon, and a sword would bend. Too much, and it would shatter. In his daily work, the blacksmith relied on a core set of tools, each with its own purpose, its own history. The anvil, often passed down through generations, was the forge's altar. Flat-topped, broad, and unyielding, it bore the scars of 1,000 projects. Along its edges were hardy holes and pritchel hole openings for holding specialized tools. The face of the anvil was used for shaping, its horn, the curved end, for bending metal with care. The hammer was not just one tool but many. The cross-peen hammer spread metal in one direction. The ball-peen rounded it. Heavy sledgehammers were used for drawing out thick billets, while lighter hammers allowed for precise finishing work. Some smiths wrapped the handles in leather or cloth to soften the grip and reduce the shock that travelled up the arm with every strike. Tongs came in a bewildering variety. Flat-jawed, wolf-jawed, scroll tongs, each designed to hold a specific size or shape of iron. The smith did not use gloves. Instead, he trusted his tools to keep hands steady and safe. To shape the iron, he heated it in a forge hearther, shallow pit or brick structure where coals glowed and flared under the wind of the bellows. The bellows, operated by foot or apprentice hand, forced air through a tuyeria clay or iron, nozzle raising the heat enough to make the iron malleable but not molten. Timing was everything. The smith watched the colour of the iron dull red, then cherry, then bright yellow-white. Each hue signalled a different working temperature. Too cold, and the iron would crack. Too hot, and it would burn, losing its cohesion and structure. There were no thermometers, no gauges, only the eye, the feel, the experience passed down by demonstration and repetition. To harden steel, the blacksmith used plunging the hot metal into water or oil. The sudden cooling locked the structure into a hard, brittle state, but this too was dangerous. Improper quenching could warp or crack the work. To temper, introduce brittleness, while maintaining strength, the smith reheated the piece to a lower temperature, then let it cool slowly. It was a balancing act. Strength without fracture, flexibility without weakness. Beyond shaping, there were finishing techniques. Filing, grinding with stone wheels, polishing with sand or soot. Sometimes, a blacksmith would carve marks or symbols into his workmaker's marks that served as a quiet signature. These were not ornamental, but practical. In an age before branding, they helped ensure accountability, and sometimes, pride. In weapons crafting, the techniques grew even more refined. Pattern weldinga method of layering different steels-produced blades with distinctive rippling patterns and superior strength. This technique was complex and time-consuming, but in regions like Saxon England or Viking Scandinavia, it was considered the pinnacle of smithing art. It's easy to think of medieval technology as simple, but within the forge, a subtle, evolving science took root. Each clang of the hammer was backed by generations of trial and error, of muscle memory and learned instinct. The blacksmith may not have known the modern language of metallurgy, but he understood iron better than most ever would. He listened to the hiss of the quench, read the light of the fire, felt the resonance of the hammer. His science was tactile, empirical, and deeply personal, and though he left no written formulae, his knowledge lives on in the tools still found in soil, in the blades that survive in museums, and in the art of smiths today who continue to shape fire into form. Beneath the stoic figure of the blacksmith, his arms like corded rope, his hands calloused and steady there, lay a quieter truth. The life of a medieval blacksmith, though skilled and respected, was often one of unrelenting physical strain, environmental hazards, and slow, invisible tolls on the body. Let us begin with the forge itself. The blacksmith worked in proximity to constant heat. The hearth, alive with flame, burned day after day, season after season. In winter, it was a source of comfort. But in summer, the forge could feel like a punishment. Temperatures soared, sweat pooled beneath heavy aprons. The air thickened with coal dust and metallic vapors, pressing into the lungs with every breath. There was no ventilation, no mask, no protection from the invisible particulates that hung in the air like ghosts of the fire. Over time, the effects were cumulative. Many blacksmiths developed persistent coughs, what some sources call smith's wheeze. Today, we might diagnose this as a form of chronic bronchitis or lung damage caused by prolonged exposure to fine particulate matter. Their breath grew shallow. Climbing stairs, or even walking uphill, became laborious in middle age. Then there were the physical injuries. The hammer, a daily companion, was both a tool and a tormentor. Swinging it repeatedly, day after day, placed tremendous stress on joints, tendons, and muscles. Elbows stiffened, shoulders ached, hands began to tremble, not from weakness, but from sheer overuse. Blacksmiths often suffered from what modern medicine might call repetitive strain, injury carpal tunnel, tendonitis, or arthritis of the wrist and elbow. Back pain was nearly universal. The forge demanded awkward, sustained positions. Iron had to be lifted, twisted, and held at odd angles. Anvils were sometimes too low or too high. There were no ergonomic workshops in the medieval world. By their 40s, many blacksmiths moved with a noticeable stoop, their spines compressed from decades of leaning over their work. Burns, too, were inevitable. Even the most careful smith would eventually brush a hot iron or stumble into a coal bed ember. Most burns were minor blisters and scorched skin, but some left deep scars. Apprentices, in particular, were vulnerable. Young and inexperienced, they often made mistakes, picking up tongs left too close to the coals, or dropping hot metal onto their feet. In larger shops, first aid was rudimentary: a cold bucket of water, a strip of linen, and a prayer for no infection. The forge also posed risks to hearing. The repeated clang of metal on anvil created an environment of near-constant noise. Over years, this dulled the senses. Many older blacksmiths became partially deaf. They did not notice the change at first, but eventually, they could no longer hear the soft voice of a child or the creak of the shop door. Only the echo of the hammer remained, fading slowly into silence. Mental fatigue played its part as well. Though blacksmiths were not isolated in the way that some tradesmen were, the work was monotonous and repetitive. Precision was essential, but creativity was rare, especially in small rural forges. The smith made the same objects again and again, and while his labor was respected, it was not celebrated. He was always on call, always expected to fix, mend, shape. There was little rest, and few holidays beyond feast days. Still, there was pride. Despite the burdens, many blacksmiths found meaning in their craft. A well-balanced axe, a perfect horseshoe, a door that swung open on newly forged hinges, these were small triumphs, and they mattered. The forge was a place of constancy in a volatile world. Storms came and crops failed, but iron was always needed. A blacksmith's value never diminished. Families, too, shaped the experience. Sons sometimes worked beside their fathers, learning the rhythm and routine long before formal apprenticeship. Wives might manage the accounts or assist with minor tasks. In this way, the forge became a family unit, a space where work and life blended. Even in hardship, the blacksmith endured. He bore his injuries with stoicism, treated his ailments with herbs or hope, and returned to the anvil each day with quiet resolve. His labor was not heroic, but it was essential. And in that daily return to the heat, to the weight, to the sound, there was a kind of bravery that never made it into stories but shaped every village and town across medieval Europe. Though centuries have passed since the last village smith doused his coals and stepped away from the anvil, the legacy of the medieval blacksmith endures quietly, but unmistakably. It survives in the hinges of ancient doors that still creak open, in the horseshoes dug up in farmers' fields, and in the very language we speak. The word smith, after all, is everywhere. Blacksmith, goldsmith, wordsmith, a title that still evokes creation, precision, and mastery. Today, we remember blacksmiths not only as craftsmen, but as symbols of endurance. Their tools were humble, their dwellings modest, but their work shaped the physical world in profound and lasting ways. Roads were safer with strong wagon wheels, fields more productive with sharpened ploughs, castles more secure with sturdy gates. Even the act of war, so central to medieval life, was made possible, in part, by the smith's unseen labor. And yet, their legacy is not solely in objects. The blacksmith embodied a model of knowledge that was deeply tactile. His education was not written, but forged. It lived in scars and muscle memory, in the understanding of how iron sings when it's ready to bend. This wisdom, passed down through apprenticeship, represents a form of learning that is both ancient and enduring. Modern blacksmiths, they still exist, carry this torch. Though fewer in number, they continue to work iron using many of the same techniques their ancestors used: heating, hammering, quenching, tempering. Some create decorative pieces, railings, knives, sculptures, while others specialize in restoration, bringing life back to centuries-old ironwork in churches and estates. A few teach, ensuring that this old craft, though no longer a daily necessity, is not lost. In workshops around the world, the anvil still rings. It is no longer the village centre, but the sound remains familiar to those who seek it, out a reminder of a time when skill was measured in calluses and soot, not in accolades or fame. The forge has become, in some ways, a refuge, a place where technology slows, where hands matter more than screens, a space where transformation still happens, slowly, under heat and pressure. The blacksmith also endures in our stories and imaginations. From Norse myths of dwarves forging enchanted weapons to the figure of Wayland the Smith in English legend, the archetype of the smith is one of magical ability, grounded in real labor. Even today, in fantasy novels and games, the blacksmith is a familiar figure, strong, quiet, wise in the way of materials and tools. And perhaps, most enduring of all, is the blacksmith's moral symbolism. He did not inherit land, or titles, or wealth. His power came from work, from waking early, from steady hands, from patient repetition. In a world often defined by class and chaos, the blacksmith stood as a figure of honest, labor-bending iron to will. Yes, but never demanding glory. In that sense, the blacksmith's life was both ordinary and profound. He shaped the everyday, made the useful, built the invisible infrastructure of medieval life. He was not knighted, but his work armored the knight. He was not canonized, but his hinges guarded the church. And so, when you next pass an old gate, or run your hand along a worn iron railing, consider that somewhere, centuries ago, a man stood at a forge. He pulled iron from the fire. He raised his hammer. And in the hush before the strike, the world held still for just a moment, waiting to be shaped. And now, as our journey through soot and iron gently comes to rest, allow yourself to drift further into stillness. The forge has cooled. The hammer rests where it was last set. The last curl of smoke rises through a cracked vent, disappearing into the calm night air. In this soft silence, we leave behind the world of the medieval blacksmither, world of endurance, of rhythm, of unyielding labor wrapped in quiet dignity. Though his hands were never idle, and his bones bore the weight of his trade, his legacy endures in ways both seen and unseen, in every lock that still turns, in every tool that still serves, in every story told with reverence for those who built more than they ever claimed. The blacksmith's life was not one of glory or riches, but it was essential. It was stable in a world often unsteady, and in his shop warm, dark, and alive with the breath of coals transformed raw, unyielding ore into objects of strength and service, not for fame, not for fortune, but because it had to be done. As you lay in rest now, let the rhythm of his life slow your thoughts, the hush of iron cooling, the deep inhale of bellows sleeping, the steady beat of the hammer, fading into memory. There is peace in the past, even among its labors. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, may the calm strength of the blacksmith's world linger with you, a gentle weight, steady and grounding, like a hand resting on your shoulder. Good night.